passage in verses 1 through 6 in the great book of Jeremiah. So Jeremiah, you may know, is referred by some people as the weeping prophet. And he's referred, and they said all he did was cry. All he did was so, woe is me, and sing out woes. But what you got to understand is, it depends on who defines you, how people may give you a name. And so people oftentimes call him the weeping prophet because he says he was bringing woes to the people. But what we got to understand when we look at the book and we look at chapter 1 and verse 10, it lets us know that God was using Jeremiah to do something radical. He was using Jeremiah because God had a plan and he wanted to rebuild, to redevelop, to replenish, but he had to do it in a certain way. So in Jeremiah chapter 1 verses 10, he talks about that he has to overthrow, he has to destroy, he has to uproot things in order to build anew and to plant anew. And so that is important for us to understand that Jeremiah is talking to the people and saying, you got to be rebuilt. There's some renewal that's required of you. That you've been doing things a certain way, but you've been coming up short. But God ain't going to let you just stay being short. And he says he's contributing and joining in with you to be able to be made anew. And that's what we got to understand. And that's what's powerful about Jeremiah. Jeremiah gets to have this conversation with the children of the house of Israel. And if you know anything about when he was called at about 18 years old. He was called into the ministry. He ministered according to the call on his life for over 40 years. We'll talk about being faithful. To a bunch of people who said, you just a whiner, you just a weeper. All you do is make noise and all you do is talk about how bad things are. He wasn't talking about how bad things were from the idea that there was no outcome and no future that they had. He was talking about it to bring their mind to an awareness to be able to say, this is your reality, but there's greater if you will accept it. And that becomes important for us to understand as we think about what does it mean to serve God? What does it mean to live this life according to how God has created us, how God has gifted us with purpose? What does all of that mean? And so we also understand this. Whenever you read in the book of Daniel about Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, some also would say,
Shadrach, Meshach.
Shadrach, Meshach, and a bad Negro. A Billy Goat. Some people would say a Billy Goat. I heard a Billy Goat. I heard a bad Negro. But so Shadrach, Meshach, and a Billy Goat. But I prefer to refer to them as Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. That's their Hebrew names. Because there's some power in that name. That's why their names were changed. Because Hananiah says, beloved by God. Who is as God? Then you get into Azariah. Azariah says, the Lord is my help. So when you're beloved by God, who can do you like God? And if there's nobody can do you like God, that means that God's still my help. And so I like to call them Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah and not use what the Nebuchadnezzar renamed them. Because he didn't want them to have their identity with God or with Yahweh, as we understood it in the scriptures. And so there's a powerful story. So when you read that story, that's the time Jeremiah was prophet. He was the prophet to the house of Israel. He was the prophet to the children of God. And so it's important for us to understand that. So we put all that together and says, so what? What do we get to? We get to the theme for this message. I believe the theme for this message is simply this. What does it mean to be God-made? Many of us will find ourselves in situations where we make ourselves, and we see that all the time, especially in culture where people say, I'm a self-made millionaire. Some people will say, I'm not just self-made, I'm corporate-made. Because I got in the system and I knew how to work the system. So then you corporate-made. But if we ever going to be the fullness of who God created us to be, we got to be willing to be God-made. Because without being God-made, we're going to find ourselves coming up a little short. So what does that mean to be God-made? Everybody know who God is. Or what I find interesting when you look at Merriam-Webster and you think about the definition of who God is, it says this. The being perfect in power, wisdom, and goodness, who is worshipped as creator and ruler of the universe. If that is the situation and we have our hearts set in that posture where we see God as the ruler of the universe, why do we submit ourselves to a lesser ruler? Why would we ever submit ourselves to somebody who's less than who God is? See, what you got to understand is people can only do for you what they got access to. You people can only do for you what they got access to means if I'm looking to be the fullness of who I am, if I know I'm a miracle and I got some things in my past that need miracle, wonder-working power, That God is the only one I can go to because people can't do what I need them to do because they don't have access. And that's where we got to find ourselves that says, if I'm going to be who God made me, I got to be willing to be fully committed to him. I can't settle for people because people are seasonal at times. Some people, like you said, fair weather friends. As long as it ain't raining outside, they're going to rock with you. The minute a storm comes, they don't act like they know you because they can't understand you. And then again, some people, again, that come in and call yourself friends, some of them only want to benefit from you, will never be a benefit to you. And you got to know the difference between those two. That you can't just think about people that come into your life and all you do is for them, but you ever hardly hear anything getting back in return. That's not a relationship. That's almost just an exchange. Yeah. And I mean, it's just a giving of who you are. And people will drain you to the core. Take everything that you have and then walk away from you. But we got a story and we got a whole Bible that tells us the Lord would never do that for us. The Lord would never leave us. He will never forsake us. That means even when I stumble and make a mistake, the Lord says, I'm still with you. I still put my name on you. I still claim you. Even when you come up short and don't glorify me in the fullness of who I am. That's what it means to be God made. Some of us, if you know, some of your friends, if you lose your job, your money start getting a little funny. They're like, yeah, we can't hang out like we used to. We like to go out and eat. And since you don't have money to eat, we didn't want to invite you because you can't go. I could go if you were my friends and you would sponsor me while I go get this meal. But what they're saying is we're not friends like that. And so we look at this and we understand God to be who he is. And we understand God in his fullness. It says someone that's held to be the most important one in existence. That's what it means. That we got to see God as the most important person in our lives. Because when we see God as the most important person in our lives, what we can't stop doing is we got to see ourselves as important as well. Some of us allow people to come in our lives and do things to us because we don't see ourselves as important. And because we don't evaluate ourselves as important, we give people who should never have access. People who should never be able to get the type of control that they have and the type of frequency that they get calling us and making contact with us because we don't see ourselves as that important. But if God, as we just took communion, was willing to send his only son, who he loved dearly, to go and die for you, you got to be important. And you're important to God. So what it means is those people who you're not important to, sometimes you got to distance yourself from them. It says, I'm going to be with the people who see me as important. I'm going to be with the people who see me as beautiful. I'm going to be with the people who see me wonderfully created. And then when we understand that, then what you do is you get encouraged by spending time with him. You get built on by spending time with him. And we're going to talk about Yahweh Elohim and what does that mean. But that's what we understand God to be, the God of covenant. And that's what it communicates, that God is a covenant. That's why when you hear Jesus talk as we walk through with Luke, and we said earlier about a new covenant, you got to understand. That's why he can say in the Great Commission, all power and authority was given to me. Yes. Now I give you, and you need to go. Because he says, I can do a covenant with you. I can declare what God is going to do for you because I know and God has given me the power to do that. Right. That's what you got to understand. There's a covenant on your life. God says, I'm in covenant with you. And what we know about the Bible is when you can't fulfill the covenant, even when you're the one who broke it and responsible to repair it, God just does miracles and loves us so much that he will repair what you did, even though you were responsible for breaking it. That's what Jesus does. God didn't break the relationship when we look in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve did. We talked about that. And so what does it mean to be made? To be put together various ingredients. To be put together various ingredients. But you got to understand, you're the totality of who you are. You got an emotional element, a physical element, a soul element, a spiritual element. You got to know a mental element. All of that is who you are. That God says, I crafted you uniquely. I wondered and I put you together because he says, I bring it all together to fulfill the purpose from which I created you. Yes. That all of it matters. There's no part of you that exists that doesn't matter. So when you see there and people say black lives matter, yes, black lives matter. Black minds matter. Black souls matter. All of that matters because we're the fullness of who we are, who God makes us to be. And then what we understand is say to be made. You heard this in Mafia talk. You see it in some of the movies you may watch, or you see nowadays in game talk. They say somebody's made. It's an assured success. But we got to ask ourselves, what do you have an assured success in? Because if it's not the will of God, then what you can find yourself is you may be thinking you have an assured success in something against the will of God. And that you become an enemy of God. And what we look at in the Bible, it says there is no enemy of God that can prevail against God. So you end up becoming part of a losing team. You become part of a team that's ill-equipped to be able to even talk with God, to even have a conversation, yet alone, and challenge God. That's where we find ourselves. So we get in this passage, and we go right into it. It says, God made. And we understand the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord. Arise and go down to the potter's house, and there I will let you hear my words. What we understand is that we got to be, in order to be God made, we got to be willing to do the ordinary to get an extraordinary revelation. To be God made means being willing to do the ordinary to get an extraordinary revelation. That's what it means to be God made. That's what we see in this first set of scriptures. It says the word came to Jeremiah from the Lord. What we understand in this passage, it says go down to the potter's house. So what we understand is God says to Jeremiah, I'm going to use your eyes to do something and minister to your heart and your mind. Because he says, you're going to go down to the house. And when you go down there, he says, I'm going to let you hear my words. And what's powerful about that, let me hear your words, is that we got to understand some of us are so arrogant, I'll use. There's another word we could say, ignorant. And we think that God's just supposed to do whatever we say instead of us being able to do whatever God says. And so God says literally that if you go where I tell you, if you move in obedience, then I'm going to tell you something. So what else, how we say that? Sometimes we got to realize the first word is not the last word. It's just an invitation to the next word. The first word is not the last word. It's just an invitation to the next word. That's how God moves. And what we understand is God says that I'm going to move on your behalf, but you still got to be faithful. There's still some requirements, but too many times we got this kind of remote control God idea. We just sit on there like Netflix, just hit the button and turn the channel. Like, God, I need you to do that. Give me a blessing in school today. Give me a blessing on the job. And you just change channels on God. And you think you're remote controlling God and calling in God. And God says no. At times you got to understand that I got a word that can sustain you, but the word got to grow in you. And the word got to grow you. So when it grows in me, it then says that I can't sit in the same limitations that I have. I can't keep struggling with the same things and not grow in God. Because God may not deliver you from everything. You may have that as a struggle, but God says, but I'm still understand my grace is sufficient for you. And if my grace is sufficient for you, that means even though it may be present, it can't stop you if you just trust God. And that's why we got to understand the importance of being able to live for God, to be able to be faithful to what God is saying. He says, go down to the potter's house. And that's so many problems. What we got to understand, here is Peter sitting there listening and crying and preaching to people who continue to look at him in a disrespectful way, who continue to minimize him to a degree, who don't want to have a sound voice, who don't want to give him credit. And God says, look, I need to talk to you, but I need you to go somewhere first. So we got to understand and ask ourselves, are we willing to be God-made or self-made? Because sometimes God is going to send us to places that we have no understanding. Right. We don't know why we're going, but God says if you go, I tell you there's something that's going to be there for your benefit. We may not understand it, and I love the way Jeremiah responds. Because what we see in the next passage is simple. So he says, so I went down to the potter's house. See, that's what it means to be obedient. That's what it means to be God-made. Being God-made means I got to understand and go when God says go. Wherever he says go, when he says it. Yes. Not when I choose to. Not the way I choose to go. But I got to go the way God says. Because being God-made says I got to be willing to understand this. I have a purpose. God has gifted me with a purpose, but I got to be refined for my purpose. Because some of us, when we come to the idea to discover our God-gifted purpose, we know our purpose, but we need to be refined in order to be able to fulfill the purpose. Because our fulfilling of the purpose glorifies God. That's why we have a purpose. Remember, I say often, your God-gifted purpose is your invitation to participate in God's mission. His mission is redemption of the whole earth. Mission is guaranteed. So he says that you got to be refined. Some of us have a purpose, but if we're not willing to be refined by God, we will only have potential in our purpose. We never will have fulfillment in our purpose. And potential purpose don't work. Potential purpose only does, it's a trick. And what it does, it deceives you and it makes you a deity. Because you will start to glorify yourself. You will start to give yourself all these high remarks because of your potential that you never act on. And we get too many times, we get in positions and we celebrate our potential, and all it really means is we don't want to really do the work and make the sacrifices to fulfill it. And you got to stop, and we got to stop giving people credit for just potential who've been living in potential for decades upon decades upon decades upon decades. But they haven't exercised it yet. That's not being God-made. That's being God-delayed. And what we got to understand is that some of us have been God-delayed. I've been there. So when I say us, I'm talking about me. I'm inclusive of. When you don't move when God wants you to move, and God says the only way you're going to be able to get the fullness of this life is to be God-made, then when you don't move, you delay being God-made. You delay the fullness that's been assigned to you. That's what we understand about destiny. God's assigns a future. He guarantees the plans that he has for you. He understands that, so we got to be able to live in it. So he says this, so I went down to the potter's house, and they was working at this wheel, and the vessel he was making of clay was spoiled in the potter's hand, and he reworked it into another vessel as it seemed good to the potter to do. This is so powerful and so understand if we just take time to understand what God is saying. And so in Jeremiah, and then sometimes in the Bible, they have allegorical speech, or they have stories that are allegorical. And what I mean by that is it uses certain things and images to be able to tell a story of more greater importance. And when we look at this passage, we see it an opportunity where Jeremiah is telling a story of how God moved in his life, but God used a story and a narrative that didn't seem to make sense. Because it says that here it goes, you're going out to the potter's house. He says that when you get to the potter's house, God said, I'm going to reveal something. But there's a deeper meaning than just the surface. And that's what happens sometimes with our relationship with God. We want to stay on the surface and we never want to go deep. But if you're not willing to go all in for God, how do you want him to go all in for you? That's what we got to ask ourselves. Because if you understand the allegorical references to this passage, then what we understand is it says that when you see, it says it goes out the potter. The potter is God. It's Yahweh. The will is life and its circumstances. The vessel is, in this time, it was specific to the house of Israel, but it's all in humanity. So what it says is God, being omnipotent and omniscient, and all that he is and all that he does, it says that he continues to work us through life situations to be able to refine us so that we're better positioned. Because what's powerful for this, as you look at this passage, it says there was a man at the potter. So the potter's at the wheel, and there he was working at his will. Whose will is it? So we understand this to be allegorical. What you realize, some of the situations that you go through are still under the hands of God. Some of the situations are still under control because it says the will represents life situations. And because they represent life situations, what we got to understand, no matter what you're going through, no matter what you're facing, God still has control. He's still there because God has the foot on the pedal of the wheel. He can stop the wheel and he can make the wheel continue. He can speed the wheel up. He can slow the wheel down. That's important for us to understand. And then when you look at this and it says vessel. Now you may see this other translations. In the other translation, like the NIV will say, they don't say translation, they don't have the word vessel. They actually use the word pot. And it says that, and it would read, and the pot was made of clay, was spoiled in the potter's hand. They would say, instead of spoiled, they would say marred, in the potter's hand, and he reworked it into another pot. What does that mean? Being God-made means you got to understand the power of this. So if we were to substitute that word pot, it gives us a better communication to some things. So if we understood that to be a pot, that the pot was marred in the potter's hand, and he worked it into another pot, what we understand is being God-made means when you're at the wheel, you never lose your identity. You started out as a pot, but you become a better pot because of who's at work in you. And so we get this idea to understand that God says, I've given you identity. I created you and gifted you with everything you need to do what I need you to do. But you got to understand that you got to be refined. So sometimes going back to the will is not just about God trying to make me all over again. No, God still says you're a pot. He just won't make you a better pot. Right. Because in being refined at the will, being refined by life circumstances, you become better to serve and fulfill the purpose upon which you were created. That's what we say. You still have the identity in God. That's the first point that when you look at it, if we were to substitute that word pot. But what we also see is, if we were to substitute the word pot, as some translations do, you see that you have an identity in Christ. You have an identity in God because the potter makes the pot. So you are created by one who you take on their identity of the one who created you. But too many times we don't take on the identity of the one who created us. We take on all these other false identities. We take on all of these other identities and we're walking around and with so many stolen identities, we don't even know who we are. So life is always a struggle because we can't get forward because we have no idea who we are on what day. And as life changes on us and life continues to turn us out, we continue to find ourselves coming up short. And some of us, instead of getting back to the place and going back to the will, we just start becoming something else. And we pick up another identity. And we'll pick up something else, doing something that's far outside, because it's easy to be a pot and think you're a pitcher. And look like you can do a certain thing. But if we know anything about most pitchers, if we keep it very simple, a pot can withstand heat. A pitcher can't. But we got to understand that. And so this idea of what we're looking at, that God has made you to whatever it is. But if we were to keep the word vessel, and I think vessel is important because we got a powerful lesson in the word vessel. Because we understand this. The tetramagoton. The tetramagoton, if you ever see the word YHWH, that's called a tetramagoton. So I got to use these big words sometimes. I did go to school. So you got to understand that. So the tetramagoton. So Yahweh, who is all powerful and all knowing, we say he's the God of the universe. So he's sitting there, he's Yahweh. He's the supreme justice. And we're looking at the court. And so we understand that Yahweh sends a vessel called Yahshua HaMashiach. Because he wasn't always called Jesus. He's called Yahshua HaMashiach. Sends Yahshua HaMashiach, who becomes the vessel of redemption, to a group of people who become the vessels of grace. So what we understand is, if Yahweh, which means I am, I is, and I will be, sends the one who declares in John chapter 4 and John 8, when Jesus sees the Samaritan woman, when Jesus is before the people, he says, I am. So he says, I am, I is, and I will be. What he says is that when we are the vessel, then all we can do is go from the Creator through the one who gives us the invitation to be who he created us to be, that says, I was, I am, and I'm going to be. So I'm not restricted by my past. I'm not held back by my past. Yes, I may have. I was this. I am now, but I got an even greater future ahead of me. That's what we got to be willing to say. That's what it means to be a vessel that says, I got to let the love of God, the grace of God pass through me. Because when it passes through me, I get my full identity. Some of us have been so lost and so pulled away from our identity, we don't get to see who God really is. We haven't seen who we really are. We look in the mirrors and we look in different places and we look and we don't know who we see sometimes. And that's important why we got to be able to look at this. So he says that here he comes in the potter's hands. He said he reworked it. And then we see that this word spoiled. So in other translations, you will see the word marred. What I like about the word spoiled, is that it's a translation. It just depends on how people translate it. The Hebrew word is sahat. S-A-H-A-T. Sahat. And what it means is this. It means to be corrupted. To be misformed. And what does that say to us? That some of us, because of life circumstances and where we were in our relationship with God, have become corrupted. Have become misformed. To be shaped differently than what we were shaped by God to be. And what God says, I don't give up on you. I use life situations, I lose the will to put you on the wheel, but knowing that when you're on the wheel, you're still in my hands to be able to shape you into who I need you to be and who I created you to be. Because just because you lose your way does not mean God can pull you back and get you on the right path. Right. That's what we got to understand. Right. We say it all the time, or we've said it frequently, it's not your way, it's Yahweh. And when we understand that, what we understand is that God will use the life circumstances, All these situations that people thought was going to defeat you, and you got to start looking at people and say, you thought this was going to defeat me, you didn't know this was going to better define me. Because that's what God does. He says, as long as we with him, we're still in his hands. And that's so important for us to understand as we think about serving God and what it means to be God-made, is realizing many a times we want to be covered by God's hands, but we never want to be aligned with his heart. Because you got to realize that God's word says, out of the abundance of a heart, a person speaks. And what we understand from this is a potter, any artist, they often imagine it in their head or in their heart. And then what their hands manifest is what they have in their head and their heart. So what we understand in this pot that's sitting there on a vessel is we've been manifested from God's heart and through his mind to be able to draw out and create something that nobody else could expect to see. But it was only because of his creativity. It was because of his beautiful nature that he says, look, I created you. I created you what you may cause to look a little different, to be shaped a little different. But he says, but you're not wrong by how I created you. And because of the way I created you, he says that if you do happen to get touched and you get a little misfigured, he says, I'll just bring you back and refine you. But can't nobody else refine you. So what you got to understand is that you can go through all those courses and all these self-help books. I'm not saying that some of them don't have value, but what I'm saying is in order for you to get the fulfillment, the full alignment into who God created you, you got to go back to the creator. You know, it's just like what was the game system? PlayStation? And what's the other one? Xbox, right? You can't have a PlayStation, the PlayStation starts not working, put Xbox games in it. And then you can't get it broken and say, well, I'm going to take the PlayStation to the Xbox and say, I need you to fix this. They're going to look at you and say, that's not our thing. I don't even want to touch that. And so what you got to realize is, while you still may be a game system, and it can look like it's the same, and it should be easy because it's probably using the same fundamentals, but it was created by somebody uniquely, wonderfully. And the one who creates it is the one who can best touch it, the one who can best fix it. So sometimes we've been going to other people and going to all of these other places looking for somebody to do something for us that they can't do because they didn't create you. Some of us are only seeing you in who you was. Some of them haven't seen you in the fullness of who you is. And because they didn't see that yet, they have no ability to comprehend who you're going to be. Because all they can think about is who you was and who they saw you then. But they don't have an understanding. This is how powerful God is and how game-changing God is. So we talked about the tetragrammaton. And what we understand about that is this. In Hebrew, besides Yahweh, Y-H-W-H, there is no is in the language. There is only I was and I'll be. So they don't say this is a table. They don't say this table is large. They would say table large. There's no is except for God. Never will be except for God. So what it is there is no recognition. You either this or you either that. They don't have an understanding or appreciation to be God-made that said, God can take you from where you are, put you through a process to make sure he gets what he needs at the end. They don't understand what process means. That's why when you look at you and see what you were, they just got the expectation that's all you ever going to be. Sounds like some people now in this America that we live in. And it's America that sit there, so some people look at you by old eyes and old names and things that started hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and all they ever see you is a slave. All they ever see you is working for me for free, benefiting me. I can't ever see you having a mind and being able to read and being able to do for yourself. I can't ever see you fully liberated. All I can see you is working for me. That's why some of us got so many gifts. And the depth of your gift was you can start a business. You can be serving and doing things and making money and generating money, not just for yourself, but for wealth. But you don't even tap into it because you got people that says, I don't see how you can do that. Because they're still looking at you what they think you were. They don't see you for who you really are. And they can't see a transition because they don't accept the transition. They don't accept a process because they don't accept God. They accept a version of somebody that we don't know who that really is, but they don't accept the Christ that we read in the Bible. When we understand the Christ we live in the Bible, again, it's clear. He don't look like Michelangelo's brother. He don't look like his sister or his uncle. He don't look like any of that. You can't see that. You can't show me what they show you now and put in people's houses and put on murals and put on stained glass windows. That don't look like cotton hair. That hair just don't look like cotton to me. You can do a lot of things with cotton, but some things ain't just going to happen. They ain't have no process like that. And so what we got to understand is, why would people do that intentionally and continue to communicate something unless they were trying to disturb you from being able to understand? That's what this is. It's an attack on God's people. There is no way that you got to look at yourself and say that all these people in this country have gotten here and they've been able to make things happen in all these different nationalities, except for black people. You can't accept that. Because what you got to understand, there's no other people in this nation that has arrived, whether they consider to be an immigrant or not, that has ever been enslaved. Only black people have been enslaved, brought to a land outside they were. The rest of them came. Oh, I want to go to America. It's so great. We didn't get that choice. We were pulled here, denied who we were, stripped of our identity, stripped of everything that made sense, stripped even of our relationship with God because they were serving God before they got here. And they gave them this fake Bible that only has 6 chapters of all the 66 chapters in the Bible. That only had portions of those 6 chapters, and they called it the full Bible. Before it got to all of that, we already had a relationship. All you got to do is read the narrative, and we can just use somebody as simple as Philip, who had a conversation and baptized an Ethiopian eunuch, or eunuch. Ethiopia is in Africa. So how did they just introduce Christ to us in America? It just don't make sense. But that's a trick. But that's why we got to be willing to be God-made. That anything somebody says to us, we got to have the confidence because of our relationship with God that says, God, I'm going to be who you created me to be, and I will never settle for less. Because who you created me will blow people's mind. It will take people into places that they said, I never saw it coming. And that doesn't matter, as long as you can see it coming. That's what the difference. And then we go home on verse 5 and 6. Then the word of the Lord came to me. O house of Israel, can I not do with you as the potter has done, declares the Lord. Behold, like the clay in the potter's hand, so are you in my hand, O house of Israel. Are we willing? So being God-made means being willing to stay in God's hands. That even when the will gets hot, even when the will gets uncomfortable, will you stay in God's hands? Because in God's hands, we have everything that we need. We often talk about how it can be painful, but you got to realize God is careful what he creates. He does it with expertise. And if you have a potter, that means that they're identified as an expert in the business of making clay. But hold on. Thank you, Jesus. Let me just go back. We talked about that last. Thank you, Jesus. Oh, man. Thank you, Jesus. Hey, so we talked about this. Look, we just talked about Yahshua HaMashiach, Jesus. And by him being the vessel of redemption, so that we become the vessels of grace that he sends out to say who I was and who I am, or who I is and who I'll be. And we understand that. What we understand and what's silent on this, thank you, Jesus. When you see this, whenever how many people have made clay before? Okay, you made clay before? What happens after you make the clay? What do you have to do? How does it get hard? You have to sit it out somewhere. Usually we put it on the windowsill so that the sun can shine on it. Because when the sun shines on it, it gets hardened. And it fully becomes confirmed on what it was. So what we understand is, unless Jesus comes and shines on our life, we can't get hardened to what God is calling us to be so that we can be confirmed so all the world can see. Because your hardening and your confirmation happens under the watch and the care of Jesus. That's how we come into this relationship. Because he's the Son that we know, that lasts for all eternity. And so we understand this clay and what it means to be in a potter's hand. We got to understand what it means to follow Jesus. And so then it simply says this. Then the word of the Lord came to me. When he was faithful, Jeremiah, going to where God sent him, which it did not make sense to him, but he went. Or it may not have made sense. The Bible doesn't say that, so let me not add that. It does not show what it does, but he went to a place because he says, God says, when you get there, then he says, I'm going to let you hear me. And what do we see? God is faithful as he makes you. God is faithful to who he's making you at. Some of us haven't heard the next story yet and haven't heard the next element of our making and of our process because we haven't gone the way he sent us. But we keep wanting to get revealed where we at. And God says, I'm not going to reveal it to you here. You got to go where I send you. Because unless you're willing to obey me, sometimes some of us can't take care